My name is Dr. Cynthia Price. I'm the Associate Program Director at University of Connecticut. And we are fortunate that we have a med school and a residency, and we do lots of things in the both. You guys already saw Dr. London up here a little bit earlier talking about SLOs. Are you up?
I think now, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, good deal. All right, so actually just to tag on real quick to what Dr. King...
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry, no. I'm Doug Franson. I was a clerkship director and an associate dean at Virginia Commonwealth University, and I'm now at the University of Washington as an associate program director. So I've kind of been on both sides of the table in terms of advising students and then interviewing applicants, which it's lended me an interesting perspective into all of this. But just to tack really quickly onto what Nick said, you know, one other thing about research is it becomes very apparent when you're doing an interview who did research just to check that box versus who did a project that they really owned and were interested in and loved. And quite honestly, I would rather see somebody who was, say, an EMIG leader who did some great innovative stuff because they loved education, as opposed to, you know, they were a tech who asked people in the emergency department whether their pain was a 4 or a 6 out of 10, and that was their only involvement in the project. So don't do stuff just to do it. Do it because you want to do it and you have some passion for doing it. All right, so I want to ask you guys a really quick question, and that is, what would you think if I told you, because one of the first questions we're going to ask about is how many interviews do I need? If I said you need 50 interviews, what would you guys say? That's too many. Well, how do you know that's too many? I don't think, you know, there's some people that don't think it's too many. What if I said, well, you actually only need 1 interview because you're only going to match at 1 program? Totally reasonable, right? Yeah, so this is a weird question. It's a hard question to answer. So what do we do in medicine when we have questions that we can't answer? We look for data, right? So how many of you guys have seen this graph before? Excellent, fantastic, this is good, right? So this is NRMP data on how many places you ranked, and you really should only rank places that you interviewed at, and how likely you are to match. And you can see it's a very nice curve that kind of tapers off somewhere in this range, right? Right around, 10 or so ranks. So if you're interviewing at more than about 10 programs, you have very much a diminishing return. Right? Your likelihood of matching is not really going up that much more. Whereas if you're interviewing down here in the 3 to 5 range, like, yeah, you know, a few more interviews is probably going to make a big difference in terms of your likelihood of matching. So that obviously it begs the question of, well, how many places do I need to apply to get 10-ish interviews? And that's a much bigger question. That's sort of
beyond the scope of this. That's a hot potato.
Yeah.
Your application is different than her application is different than everybody. We are going to say that one is going to lie outside the scope of what we're going to talk about today, which is the actual interview. But we will, at lunchtime, entertain some questions about, well, how many do you think I should have because I'm coming from the military, or I have 297 on the boards. How many do you think I need? So we'll entertain some of those questions, but that is outside the scope of what we are going to talk about.
Correct. I will say, I apologize, I wasn't here earlier. I had to go to some committee meetings, but if the Student Advising Task Force stuff has not been thrown around, they have put together some fantastic materials on all of this. So just really quickly, while we're still talking about interviews, I'm sorry, did you go ahead? There's been a handful of studies on this. The average cost of an interview, and this is from an East Coast program, is somewhere in the neighborhood of $350 to $400 when you add in transportation and lodging for the interview itself. And the average applicant, again to the same East Coast program, spent about $8,300 interviewing in emergency medicine. And these are people who are interviewing at an average of 10 to 12 programs. So you can imagine that as you start interviewing at 13, 14, 15, those numbers really start to add up a lot. And for most of you, I assume that you're not independently wealthy, and so that money is just getting rolled into your student loans, and it will be several more years until you pay it off. So as you start adding interest in, those numbers get really big.
Some of you are actually independently wealthy, or you have 2 whole months off to interview, see the world, go look at some different parts of the country that you never have before. Just be careful about the balance after you get that 12 to 14. Even in pursuit of just seeing the country and looking at some different places, you kind of have to think. If you guys are on the forums or the boards at all, people hate people who go on 18, 19, 20 interviews just because. So just look at the balance. I looked few places. I went up to Hennepin and got off the plane and said, oh, no. I can't do the winter tundra, not my place. And maybe had I looked and investigated the weather a little bit more carefully before I got on the crop duster that took me to the winter tundra, I would never have gone in the first place. But I felt bad that I took somebody's spot. So it's a balance. There's a sweet spot.
Where are you now?
Yeah, I'm in the University of Connecticut, which had 9,642 days of winter this year. We got spring
polar
yesterday.
vortex, something a year or two ago. But I'm glad that you found a place that's not winter tundra.
I'm originally from Tucson, Arizona, so that was a little bit of a change for me.
All right, well, so that's sort of a good segue to the next thing is sort of communication. How do we communicate about interviews? How do you communicate with programs about interviews? So the first thing that I'll say is that your dates for interview invitations are pretty variable. Some programs, like the Winter Tundra programs, really try and get their invitations out as early as possible because they don't want to be interviewing people in January, but they want to give you enough time to plan your travel.
Sure, and you'll hear that the med school people, the CDM people, were looking at, oh, let's have an international release date for programs. And when they first put that on the listserv, we laughed because it went out there and the whole side of the country beyond the East Coast was like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. October 15th is when we should extend, and then we'll start November. And there were crickets from the East Coast programs because we have snow. And so it finally became that probably was not going to happen. They were going to make one date where they were releasing interviews. So my program, the first day of interviewing is October 15th, and that would have to add on a little bit more if we went later. But depending on the weather, we also build in a couple of snow dates that we also fill, and we go ahead and utilize those even if we don't need them because we want the opportunity to make sure we see enough people.
So, as you just mentioned, the bulk of programs wait until the dean's letter comes out, which is typically October the 1st, and then, they need a week or two to process your application, look over all that stuff, factor your dean's letter into everything else. Quite honestly, we're pretty busy folks, and looking over a bunch of applications twice, once before the dean's letter and once after, is not really feasible. So there's a whole slew of programs that sends out invitations somewhere in that first week or two of October. And as she mentioned, there is a group, it was the county programs that actually got together and said, we're going to have sort of a common release date. So the take-home message is that there is a whole range of when you will hear from programs. And that tends to make students super nervous, right? Because your friend just got an invitation to the University of Connecticut, and you haven't gotten anything, but you didn't apply to University of Connecticut. And so you start getting, I haven't heard anything. So you got to be a little bit patient early in the game and not get freaked out because you haven't heard from programs just yet.
Yeah, people always want to know, oh my gosh, it's October 28th. And they said when those program directors went to ASAP and came back, all of a sudden there was going to be a landslide of opportunity, and that's when all my invitations were going to come. And it's been 3 days and I haven't heard anything. You kind of need to breathe a little bit and trust in the process. If it gets to about mid to end November and you still are sitting on less than 6 interviews, you might need to check in with your advisor, not might, absolutely, and decide some strategy. What is it about your application that's not garnering enough attention? Or what did you miss? Did you apply too narrowly? That would be your time because most of us are still interviewing into mid, late, and even early February for the end, but that's about the point where all of the invites have gone out. And I'll talk a little bit about Interview Broker, but it's sad to go in and try to book an interview and all the dates are already filled, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah, you'll hear a common theme from us, and that is talk to your advisor, keep your advisor in the loop, talk to your advisor, ask your advisor. Because your advisor will know, right, of all the students in your class that are going into emergency medicine, who's gotten interview invites from which schools. They will have the list, hopefully, of the schools that you've applied to if you give it to him or her. And so they can kind of get a sense of, oh, you're not getting interviews, this is a problem, we need to jump on this. Or, no, actually the schools that you're waiting to hear from just haven't released their interview dates yet. So definitely keep your advisor in the loop.
We'll go ahead and take it. Go ahead.
Sorry, quick clarification question. Did you say most invitations will have gone out by the end of November?
Yes. Yes. Now, most of us, my program, clearly, we get 1,000 applications. I'm probably going to fill with that first round about 70% of my applications, and then we start pulling people off of the wait list. People will double book because everybody says yes to the first 10 that they get, right? And then they start thinking, okay, well, I only got one in California and all the rest are over here. I don't really want to spend the money to get out there. And so now I'm going to start being strategic because I have 14 to play with or whatever. And so we actually will start pulling people off the wait list pretty early, and that goes all the way to January. We are pulling people last minute, whether they got stuck in a snowstorm or they've run out of money, or they again have decided for some reason they don't want to come to the East Coast or they don't want to go to the West Coast, some of those things. So you should not despair, but the process is a little fast and furious, and then it trickles. But the trickles are still, there's no correlation if you look at the research in the people that we interviewed in October versus the people that we interviewed in January. They all kind of have the same match rate. It comes out in the wash.
Yep. Yeah, I would just echo that. You know, unfortunately, all the programs want to interview that MD, PhD, who's a Nobel Prize winner and a former Olympic athlete, right? And so that person gets 86 interview applications on October the 15th, and they can only go to one. And so it takes a little bit of time for the spots to sort of bounce around and for the absolute top-tier folks to figure out where they want to go, and then spots open up. And that does not at all affect your competitiveness. Don't assume that because you were in that second wave of invitations somehow the program doesn't want you. That's not true at all. They didn't interview that Olympic athlete, and so that person is not going to match at their program, leaving the spot for you.
Again, you guys look at the forums and you go, well, I'm so offended that I didn't get an invitation in October or November, and you're a little bit miffed. That doesn't have anything to do with the price of tea in China. It might be that you have got 4 people that are reviewing 1,000 applications, and they are divided alphabetically or geographically, and it just happens to be when your application is reviewed. If we go around the first round and September 15th you have everything in, and then your dean's letter comes in on the 1st and you're ready to go, that's great. If you only have one slow at that time on October the 2nd, I might go all the way through the rest of my assigned alphabet and then come back and hit you again, and by that time it's December 4th. Your second slow might have hit. So if I can say anything about trying to get interviews, have your stuff in early. The best you can do to prepare for yourself is to make sure that the first time we go through that your stuff is in line. And many of you don't have control over visas and when you guys are going to get your aways, but make sure to the best of your ability that everything you can have uploaded, you have uploaded. There are some people we will offer interviews to without the dean's letter even, because the package is complete and tight. So those things will come in. Let's talk about Interview Broker for 1 second. So most programs, I think about 60% of programs are on Interview Broker. People are going that way. Interview Broker is great for coordinators because it allows you guys to self-schedule. If there are 4 people waiting for a particular date, if somebody cancels that date, Interview Broker automatically sends an email out to that person and says, hey, you have 32 seconds because that slot is now open for you. So it takes a lot of the communication that goes to the coordinators away. There are some people that are trying to utilize the ERIS scheduler. There are not very many EM programs on that. It's not particularly facile and easy, and I think the way most of EM is going is to Interview Broker. But there are programs, especially since we've added so many programs in the last 3 years, who are still using a homegrown version of, I have this many dates and this many people, and I'm going to book them and keep handwritten wait list, and then the coordinator has the ability to fill those as needed. And so Interview Broker works well. We'll talk a little bit about how much you should be pushing the coordinators for places you have not heard from, especially if they are not on Interview Broker. And I would say, again, give them to about November, and then go ahead and start asking a question or two.
So I think we'll probably use the generic term interview broker, just again, because most people are using it. For any electronic scheduling system, there's one other called Thalamus that some programs are using, and ERAS is theoretically working to improve theirs. But basically, you know, the idea is it's an electronic list, keeping track of things where communication becomes very automated. One of the biggest advantages of that is it makes it really easy for you as an applicant to cancel interviews, right? It used to be a little bit painful. You'd have to call this coordinator, and I'm so sorry, I want to cancel my interview.
Can I change? Can you
right,
put me
and
someplace
people would
else?
think that somehow cast them in a negative light. And so it's taken that piece of the communication away, and it's also automated the process that as soon as somebody cancels, it reopens that spot back up to the next person on the list.
Which is great unless you cancel within whatever window the particular program has set. Our window is set for 2 weeks. If you cancel within 2 weeks, that's going to be filled by my coordinator. It's not going to automatically self-schedule because, again, in the middle of the winter time, we want to make sure that that's when we are looking. If I'm in Connecticut, I'm looking at Boston, I'm looking at New York, who could potentially get in without having to make a whole bunch of travel arrangements, or who's in the area, and they've let me know they're in the area doing an away at Yale, and they would love to come up and interview at UConn, and they just let me know as part of the communication. That would be sometimes when we put those in. It's okay to cancel, but last minute cancellations are a no-no. SAEM hates them, PDs hate them, your colleagues hate them, because if I get there and there are 9 people there instead of 10, I get to the end and I think, wow, that's a spot that somebody could have had that potentially might want to come to my program. We take it seriously. It is the most important thing we do with our lives all year round, is to look and see who's going to uproot their life, their support network, maybe family, maybe kids, maybe get up and go someplace really far away. So we look. The application is not just an application, it's a person. So we look for those. So last minute cancellations that we can't fill are bad. We tend to pick up a phone and call the PD and say, hey, your person boned us out on the last minute. Is there anything aware that you are aware of going on that we should be aware of to try to see if we can be helpful? And if you just kind of canceled out because you got tired and your program is not aware, that's people they kind of know. As we have said and said again, the world is really small in emergency medicine, so just proceed with caution.
Dr. Hiller, you have a question?
Yeah, so this came up for us at our institution this year, and I'll say it really doesn't affect you that much, to be honest, if you cancel to a program that you're not going to go to, but think about how it affects that program's perception of all of the students that are in our institution.
Okay, you know, and when we're talking about canceling, obviously sometimes stuff happens. You know, your flight gets canceled, there's a weather delay. We once had an applicant who got horrific gastroenteritis and ended up in our own emergency department. You know, so when that stuff happens, and it will happen, you just notify the program as early as possible. You know, that's especially true like in places where there's lots of programs, you know, like Philly or Chicago or New York, where they might actually be able to scrape up another applicant even on extremely short notice. But just, you know, the earlier that can happen, the better off, right? So if your flight gets delayed and it's the day before, call the coordinator right then and there. Hey, my flight's been delayed. I'm trying to get an earlier flight. I'm doing everything I can to get to your program. Because sometimes, you know, when we realize that an applicant has canceled because of something that was totally out of their control, we'll do things. We've actually Skype interviewed applicants. You know, I'm from Seattle. It's not the easiest place in the world to get to, and certainly not to loop in with interviews at other programs. But so we have arranged Skype interviews for a guy whose flight got canceled, and he literally just could not make it back out to Seattle, but he was very, very, very interested in our program, and he ended up very high on our rank list. So, you know, do everything you can to keep people in the loop when stuff happens, because it will happen.
We're going to move forward. So preparing for your interview, I would say for your attire, dress professionally. There is the perception that professional has different interpretations for different people. I would say don't go too far out on a limb. Yes, maybe your tattoos can be all uncovered, and maybe you can try a pink suit as opposed to a gray or blue suit, but I wouldn't take that too far. You want to stand out for the right reason, and not for the wrong reason. And so for females, I would say make sure you are groomed appropriately with either a skirt or pants that go along. It's not a big deal. Sometimes we've seen some interesting dresses with a sweater. Not quite sure it puts you on the same line as everybody else who actually has a blazer on, but we've seen some nice dresses with a blazer, and that ended up just fine. And so just trying to keep it, appearance matters. If we had one person that came in and literally she was very well endowed and had a blouse on that had single buttons. Nobody needs to be distracted by that when they are trying to interview. And so just make sure your clothes fit. We had a guy also that came in, he was like 5'2", and that suit was built for somebody that it was about 6'2", and he just was drowning in it. And we just went, well, kind of not figuring out what's going on with this person. So your clothes need to be clean, they need to fit, and they need to have a modicum of decorum in terms of professionalism.
Yep. And just along similar lines, you know, something may happen. We had an applicant who lost their luggage one time, or their luggage got lost, I guess I should say. You know, showed up, his shirt was untucked, his hair was still all mussed up, you know, hadn't really taken the time. Like, so even if something like that happens, make the best of what you've got. You know, tuck your shirt in, go to Walmart and buy a belt really quick. I'd lost a tie on an interview once, and I had to buy a tie in the middle of the night.
I showed up with 2 left shoes, a blue one and a black one.
Right, but so you know, you do what you can and just sort of own up to that stuff and admit, like, I'm sorry that I'm not quite up to the standards, but here's what happened.
I will say, as a million miler for Delta, you need to get used to rolling without a checkable suitcase every time. There should be 0 reason in your life that you ever need to check luggage. You don't need that much stuff. That's all I'm going to say.
On the 3-stop trip.
That's all I'm going to say.
All right, so one other thing, you know, you look at this kid's body language, right? Does he look comfortable? Does he look like a happy applicant there? Right? So definitely, you know, all schools, or almost all schools as far as I know, offer opportunities for mock interviews. A lot of residency programs do this. Take the time, you know, if you can get somebody to interview you, how you sit, how your posture is, how your body language is, how you interact with people. It's good information to have about yourself and to work on for yourself. You know, learn to mirror the emotions and postures of your interviewer so that you seem more engaged and more interested.
Let me just say one more thing while you're preparing. If you get there the day before, the night before, whatever, figure out where you're going the next day so you've got all the bugs worked out if you can. We had somebody that drove up from New York and they were worried about traffic, and God bless them, got there, and we have a Dunkin' Donuts about a block away from our campus, and so he got in, and the roads were better than he thought it would be, and got there at about 6 a.m., and our interview started at 7:30 in the morning, and my poor guy was still asleep in the car at 9 o'clock when we were trying to find him. We love that he tried to get here earlier, and he wasn't tied up in the traffic, and he actually did well, but early just means making sure you're still appropriately taking care of the details and getting where you need to be. And please know, as soon as your plane arrives, your interview has started. We actually had somebody who came in, and the Uber driver was the program's director's wife's brother. And the conversation in the car about some of the things went on. Got back. Please remember that whole thing about being on that Dr. Berger and whoever else was talking about, you're on. When the plane lands, you're on. So just think about it. Lots of preparation goes through for everything, but as soon as you arrive in the city, you just don't know who could potentially be looking at you.
Yep. I would argue your interview starts as soon as you initiate contact with the program, whether that's email with the coordinator or a phone call to the coordinator. You know, all of your interactions should be professional and the best of you, because you're absolutely right. You never know. And we have stories too of, you know, a campus bus driver who was good friends with the department chair, and just, you know, little things where you hear about stuff that people didn't think was going to be observed, but it was.
I will just tell you, if there's an opportunity for you guys as students to stay with the residents overnight, and we realize interviews are expensive. Many programs will have a program where you can stay with a resident. Be cognizant that that is also part of your interview. We had somebody that got taken off the list a couple of years ago because they left their dishes on the table and they threw the towels on the floor. Yeah. Just think about every aspect of what you are doing. But as you are looking for different places, just know your interview, it goes beyond the standard boundaries of just a regular interview.
Yep. Yeah, I was going to say, we had a crumpled up name tag under the chairs one time instead of in the tray. I was like, oh, who did, oh. So, you know, just little things, right? Like if you wouldn't do it at your parents' house, don't do it on an interview. So just coming back to kind of preparing for your interview really quickly, you know, there's a lot of standard questions that you're going to be asked. Make sure that you have answers ready for those questions.
You
right?
practice them now.
Yeah. Why emergency medicine? Why our program? What's the worst thing that you've seen? I mean, you can find lists of these things on the internet.
Tell me about leadership opportunity. Tell me about what you learned from the stinkiest patient that you took care of.
Tell me about your research. Exactly. I mean, all that stuff is very, very common. So practice answers to those questions so you're not sort of thinking about them in the moment. And because it looks like you're like, if somebody says, why emergency medicine, and you're hesitating and stumbling on that answer, it makes me think you don't really know what you're getting yourself into, or maybe you're considering more than one special. You seem a little less genuine as an applicant.
We asked a question about, tell me something negative about emergency medicine, and people are like, I love it, it's fantastic, it's the best specialty ever. And we're like, this person has no clue what we do every day with our lives. So practice for those ones. There are tons and tons of lists out there.
Yep. And at the same time, come up with questions that you want to ask at programs. You know, whether it's about, so stuff that's readily available on the internet, obviously don't ask those questions because that information is readily available. So things like the schedule or the patient volume, things like that.
It's also mentioned in the overview, and if you sound like you didn't pay attention in the overview and you didn't look up the program, it looks bad.
Yeah. And then another thing is to sort of frame your questions in terms of who they are appropriate to ask, right? You don't ask a chair about the resident schedule or about moonlighting opportunities, right? That is not a question to ask of a chair. And you should also make note of the tone with which you ask your questions, right? So to ask a program director like, oh, I see you still do a general surgery month. Most of the programs I've been at don't do that anymore. Why do you guys do that, right? That's really confrontational. But to ask a question like, oh, I see that you guys do a general surgery month. What is it that your residents get from that month? Or what do your residents say about that month? Or what's your perceived value of that month, right? You're asking the same question, but in a very, very different way. And so sort of thinking through those questions ahead of time, right? Make a list of them. I love it when an applicant comes in with a little notebook or, you know, pulls out their iPad and says, oh, yeah, of course I have some questions for your program.
Right, because many times when they don't have questions, we're like, are we just ticking a box because we're in a popular place to be? We lie between New York and Boston, and so we're just on the list. And sometimes we can tell when we're just on the list, but I like when somebody's coming and they've looked and they're like, oh, I see you guys do ultrasound. I see you've got a new resuscitation fellowship. Sometimes, in talking about the appropriateness of asking stuff, some things you're not going to ask the PD, but you might ask the particular people who are interviewing you their specialty. So if you've looked up and you know who's going to be interviewing you and it's the ultrasound director, ask her questions. If you get in front of my desk and you're a brown person and you might want to say, what support do you have here for brown people, or do you have any other people, or what's going to happen when I get here? Am I going to be lonely? I might be the appropriate person to ask. And I'm glad that you've looked and said, oh, I've done a couple of different things. So just look, and if you're interviewing with the critical care person, ask them some critical care things. But we want to figure out how our program suits your needs. And we can tell by your questions what you're looking for. So just kind of be engaged and interactive and look.
Yep. And I would say kind of have two lists of questions for every program that you interview at. So one list is a set of just kind of generic questions that you're going to ask at most, if not all, of the programs that you interview at, which will help you compare program to program, right? How did this program answer this question of something that's very important to me versus how that program opened to it? And then a second tier of questions. Ideally, you find out who you're interviewing with before your interview, and you can come up with, oh, that person is the ultrasound director, that person is Brown.
You glance at the faculty beforehand, and you're like, oh, she's from Arizona, and I have a connection.
Yeah, and I will tell you that as an interviewer, that kind of thing, it really makes an impression that you're truly interested in my program. If you took the time to look people up and look up what they did and see what papers they published or what their academic area of interest is, that really says a lot about your level of interest in that program, as opposed to did they just check a box because they're on the way to somewhere else.
Sure, and we will ask that when you are asked questions to please answer honestly. We have interviewers that say, teach me something, and if you say in your interest, you play guitar, and then they reach in the closet and they pull out the guitar and want you to bust out a song and you really can't do it, We have people that write down languages. We have multilinguists here, and they will change that interview. If you wrote down you are fluent in Spanish and French, he can interview you in Spanish and French and English. Yeah, be ready for it. And so it's just about being honest and putting your best foot forward. You guys are uniquely suited to take care of the world. That's why you're interested in emergency medicine. You don't have to fluff. There's some reason that already draws you to emergency medicine. Don't put on the fluff.
Yeah, well, and if you put on a facade, right, on your interview day, and then you end up matching at that program, that's going to make things a little bit awkward when you show up and people think that you're one person, and that's not really who you are. And that may also make you unhappy at that program as a resident, right, because you were being this person that's really not you, and so it kind of skews your sense of fit at that program.
A couple more things for us to end with. I will say, when you come in, be positive. He mentioned it already, but if you are bad-mouthing other programs, so why are you looking at us? Well, I rotated down at such and such, but I didn't really care for the way their residents act or whatever. Again, it's a small world, so try to be the positive light. I am looking all over because, or I know I've always lived over here, but now it's my opportunity to do this. You can always put things into a positive light. If you look at the research that somebody already referenced about sending a thank you note after your interviews, it matters. I don't think we care whether it's paper or email, and if you want to get them done on the plane on the way home, we love it. Somebody sent last year, their emails all had a picture of themselves, so we could put a picture with a face and then went back and said, had a really nice email. So it's not mandatory, but if people are out there doing it, and the researcher says people are looking at post-interview communication, that's the pretty much extent legally. Top talk is cheap, cheap, cheap in the match. And so please, if you are going to say we're ranking you #1, and we don't believe you. You don't believe us when we say we're ranking you #1, but a thank you note and of you to continue expressing your interest in our programs is fantastic.
Yeah, it's a violation of match rules, actually, for you to tell a program where you're going to put them on your rank list, or for them to tell you where they're going to put you on their rank list. That said, you can certainly indirectly communicate that information. I am really interested in your program because of these things that you offer, because of this faculty member that I really connected with, right? And so to say a thank you note and sort of reiterate why you're very interested in that program is an absolutely positive thing.
We love the non-form ones. Oh, I so appreciated you asking about my mother and her dealings with breast cancer. I felt connected to you or whatever. It's nice when it's just not a form. You actually take the time to do it. So maybe jot down some notes during your interviews. We will be around at the lunch tables. Our schedule is a little off kilter, so that's why we're talking a mile a minute. We will let the next person get up here so that we can get caught up on the schedule a little bit, but we will be around at lunchtime. We know that most of you in here are the people that are going to be seeing us this upcoming year, so welcome, look for us, and come visit. Thank you.